is an active duty U.S. Army military intelligence officer who is serving as executive officer for the Intelligence and Security Command headquarters. He is an alumnus of the Institute, and he was our valedictorian for the class of 2017, which is quite an achievement because he has had a lot of very serious competition. Andrew's previous assignments include 2 deployments to Afghanistan as an Infantry Platoon Leader and an Assistant Brigade Intelligence Officer, and service as the Battalion Intelligence Officer for the 1st Battalion 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Andrew is terrific, and he has been participating actively in some of our other very major public events. Last week we had our Chancellor's Council meeting where supporters from around the country came here to hear presentations by our faculty and alumni, and Andrew has been involved in making these types of public presentations, and we're just delighted that he can, and the breadth of his expertise is remarkable, the different territory he covers, and I just would like to welcome Andrew to the podium with gratitude for your many contributions to the country and to this school. Sir.
Sorry, I'm a bit at a loss. Okay, so while we take care of this, I'll just let you know that I'm not here in an official capacity in any way. I'm wearing this because I just left the AUSA conference and I didn't have time to get changed. So nothing that I say is government policy or Army policy or the views of the DoD. It is strictly my opinions as a private citizen. You got it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There it is. There it is.
Oh, working. Perfect.
Okay, so the article that I had published was about the reconnaissance techniques between Germany and the Tsarist Russian Empire on the Eastern Front during World War I. I chose the topic because, partly because it's not terribly popular among World War I scholarship. We gravitate toward the Western Front because we know it better. There's more things there in English. It was more widely covered to the American eye, and it had more, it was just a higher profile event. But on the Eastern Front, there are a lot of valuable and important things that we saw and observed that are, that I think are critical to remember 100 years later. So first, some things to get out of the way is the differences between the Eastern Front and the West, because the wars were not the same between the two of them. On the Western Front, we saw a 300-mile front between northern France almost down to the Alps. It was mostly static. You sort of knew where the enemy was, so figuring out where he was not as important as when he was going to attack and where he was going to mass his effects. The Eastern Front was about more than 1,000 miles, and it spanned from East Prussia all the way to almost to Moscow past the Pripyat marches. And the front shifted about 100 miles in total over the course of the war, because the gains that you could achieve over that were much more significant than you could achieve in the West. We saw the war of movement and maneuver that the Western armies wanted to have in the West, what the Germans wanted to accomplish with the Schlieffen Plan but couldn't because they ran into the French fortifications. They could do a lot more of that in the East, but it still remained as indecisive there as in the West. So we'll talk about the relative differences between the organizations that fought in the Eastern Front. And I'm going to cover 3 major military operations. The first I'm going to talk about is the Battle of Tannenberg, which was not an accurate name. It was actually near Olsztyn, Poland. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. It was at Olsztyn, Poland, and then immediately followed by the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. They're treated as two battles, but I see them as one continuous military action. The second is the Gorlice-Tarnov Offensive of 1915, and then the last I'm going to cover is the Brusilov Offensive of 1916. So the Russians, if we look at how they organized as an intelligence gathering force, they had a lot of potential, and one would think that they could have done much better than they did. But there were some reasons for their incapability, or their reduced capability as an intelligence force. They had the largest cavalry force in Europe going into the war in 1914 because they had divisions and armies of Cossacks, and the Cossacks formed almost all of their cavalry and were well suited to scouting missions, but they were never employed as such. The Tsarist or the Tsardom had long experience with strategic intelligence gathering, and they had done so effectively during what we call the Great Game period, the contest between them and the British for dominance of Central Asia. They had aggressive intelligence collection operations throughout Central Asia and facilitated their rapid expansion during the 19th century. And they had a general staff department, the 5th department of the general staff, as I recall, which was devoted to analysis and clandestine collection. They generally did very well. They had already assessed, they knew of the Schlieffen Plan by the time that the Germans were going to execute it. But they had some issues with complacency, and they had some spectacular intelligence failures, most importantly the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And so the intelligence apparatus that the Russians brought to the First World War was the reformed, fairly new organizations from the lessons they learned from the Russo-Japanese War. They had, as I said, they had effective strategic intelligence going into World War I, and they could have sustained this. However, they fell into a trap of optimism because they expected it to be a short war, as everyone did, and they disbanded their intelligence staffs and sent all of those officers to the front because they thought they would be more useful as infantry platoon leaders, not really platoon leaders, but tactical commanders to drive towards Berlin quickly. They thought they would be more useful than having them conduct intelligence, and when the war didn't go as they expected to, they paid for it. When you look at how they organized their intelligence capabilities, you see they organized it for an outdated form of warfare. The military culture that Russian officers had was largely formed from the Napoleonic era. They expected to clash on a field of battle, and they were going to bring their massed cavalry and deliver a decisive flanking maneuver and crush the enemy completely, as they wanted to do back in the 1800s, and it simply wasn't viable anymore. So when you look at how this is organized, you see this is an army formation at the top there, and which is an organization that they brought to field in, let's say in Tannenberg, they had 230,000 people in an army-sized formation, and that commander was the one who had control of the intelligence assets. So it was centralized at this very high level, and they had massed all of these capabilities together. The same was true for their Air Force. They had the second largest, I think one of the largest air forces in Europe at the time. A lot of it was French-built equipment. And like the cavalry, they also centralized it as being direct support to the army level. As I'll flip through the Germans, you'll see that they approach this in a completely different organizational fashion. But what this shows you is that all of the important decisions of tactics and of operations reside at the army level, because all of that information is flowing up to his staff and not to subordinate staffs. So this is sort of what some of their intel capabilities looked like. What you see on the top left is an Anasol D5. It's a French-made aircraft. A lot of their aircraft were French. On the right, not an original picture, but probably one of the best resolutions that I've seen. That is a Grigorievich M5 flying boat. It's built out of wood and fabric, and it was one of their most popular reconnaissance planes. On the bottom of the pictures, you see various Cossack cavalry organizations. So the German order of battle was for Tannenberg, and representative of how they approached operations, was they had decentralized their intelligence capabilities. They had a smaller force than the Russians in every way. They had a smaller air force, they had smaller cavalry, where they pushed these things down to lower echelons and empowered subordinate commanders to make decisions so that that information was filtering up rather than going to the top and then being pushed down. Their air force was one of the smallest in Europe at the time, but it was just the most well employed. And you can see here the army level formation is at the top. This is the German 8th Army as it fought at Tannenberg. So the top block is the 8th Army command. Right below it you see some aviation capabilities. But now you look below at the division level. Each division commander has his own aviation battalion, and then or corps level has his aviation battalion, and then at the division level below corps, which is this third row here, each of them has a cavalry battalion that can support their operations. And so this reflects an officer and a military culture that was much more oriented toward detailed and scientific planning, generally better educated throughout the ranks. And whereas the Russians saw the importance of the decisive element in war to the Russian officer of 1914 was the human element. It was his valor and his readiness to charge the enemy. For the German, that was important, but perhaps as important was how well he was supplied, how well the plan was put together, and did they know what to do, which is an entirely different set of problems if you're very brave but you don't exactly know what to do. So you see, these are some of the German capabilities that they brought to bear. In the top left, you see a fairly typical observation balloon. That's a manned platform, so you can see the basket right here. On the top right, you see German cavalry. On the top left, on the top right is German cavalry about 1914, 1915, early in the war. On the bottom left is late in the war, so you can see the more advanced helmets. They're wearing the gas mask. And then on the bottom right is one of their most successful aircraft of the war. It's called the Ettrich Rumpeltraube. It was perhaps the first stealth aircraft. You don't see it in this picture, but it was built with materials that happen to be rather translucent. So if you were a ground observation and you looked up to see this, it was much harder to see than most other aircraft at the time. This aircraft was devoted almost entirely to observation. It was a monoplane. It didn't carry arms, but it did carry cameras. And from what I read, it seemed to have pretty good flight time because it was comparatively light in relation to others. So intelligence in general in World War I, this was true for both the East and the Western Front, is that one of your primary source of intelligence was human, and it specifically came from prisoner debriefings. Second form of human that you would get would be cavalry, and also reporting from your scouts, and they would be positioned forward in static observation posts. And these posts, usually for the infantry, they were redoubts dug forward as close to the enemy as you could get so they could listen and observe without hopefully being shot. Aircraft at first in World War II were also a human system, believe it or not, because in 1914 it was quite rare to put a camera in an aircraft. So they would send up aircraft with scouts, and the scouts would observe what they saw and then try to remember it and then come back down and then tell the commander what they saw. And it's something I thought it was kind of amusing 100 years later is one of von Hindenburg's memoirs. He talks about at one point leading up to Tannenberg, they had to wait. They couldn't get rapid information from their aircraft because the scouts had hypothermia, and they had to wait for them to warm up before they could produce any actionable intelligence, which is rather bizarre. You'd think an aircraft could see or at least radio down, but they didn't even have radios in the planes at the time. And then observation balloons were critical, so they provided much better station time than your fixed-wing aircraft. They were better suited for holding cameras, at least initially. And early in the war, they were relatively safe from being shot down, and that changed later as the balloons became more targetable as equipment became better. And finally, World War I was the dawn of SIGINT. And I'm going to talk about here at Tannenberg, SIGINT was decisive in the Germans' ability to defeat the Russians. And it was, I would venture to say it may have been the first SIGINT battle in recorded history. So right now what you're looking at is the situation map of Tannenberg. And so what happened in Tannenberg, briefly, is that the Russians quickly mobilized in 1914 and invaded East Prussia. Their goal was to get to Berlin as quickly as possible before the Germans could prepare, because they were expecting the Germans to be embroiled in the Schlieffen Plan. The German commander of the 8th Army saw this, and as the Russians were charging west, he fell back. And he was later relieved, one of the first people to be fired over telephone. He was relieved by von Moltke because he didn't put up much of a fight and did not stop the Russians. The Russians did not prepare for this battle. They just mobilized their forces and moved as quickly as possible without providing for their logistics. And so the speed surprised the Germans, but as soon as the Germans turned around and engaged the Russians, their offensive fell apart. And so one of the things that the Germans did successfully at Tannenberg is, as they retrograded from the east, as they retrograded west, they used the cavalry formations that I said were decentralized. They pushed them forward and they did what we call a streamline. And a streamline is where you send your very mobile and not very dense formations ahead of your main body, and they report on what the enemy is doing. They don't make contact, they don't engage, they just observe and report. And that streamline is rising. Their job is to not be seen. And so the cavalry did that. Now they were seen because they were on horses, but they were good at staying generally out of engagement with the Russians, who invaded with mostly an infantry force, and they held the cavalry back because they were going to charge at the cavalry against the mass formation. That's intact. And so as the Germans were retrograding, they conduct a change of command, and then you get Hindenburg and Ludendorff become the commanders of the Germans. They replace the 8th Army commander, and they start providing, they fortify their lines. And what happens is, while they're using this new system called radio, the German radio operators start to listen to the Russians, because there weren't so many radios that they had to do it all the time. That's the next time they start listening to the Russians. And the Russians are describing what they're doing in they're not using so many. And so these radio operators are now writing down the instructions that the Russians are passing up to their headquarters. And over the course of Tannenberg, about 100 messages were passed. And what happened was that as the Russian First Army, or as it was the Second Army, started to close with the Germans, they knew where the Second Army was going to attack. They could prepare quickly. They could position their forces, destroy this much larger force in detail, and then get out of the way for where the Russians were actually going to move. So this is one of those radio stations that the Germans use. Interestingly, this is perhaps 21st century technology, because it's all bicycle powered, it's electricity. So you get some guys, they shuttle a bike, you get your energy, you get your electrical power, and then you can transmit and receive radio signals. This was from later in the war. This is not at Tannenberg. The home is to that way. So as the Germans are retrograding, they destroy the Second Army. The First Russian Army does not assist the Second Army. It's paralyzed. And they knew that this was happening for two reasons. The first is that they heard it over the radio. The second reason is that they had wisely employed a former defense attaché to support the 8th Army, and he knew the commanders that were fighting at Tannenberg, and knew that the commander that was defeated first, Samsonov, and the commander that they defeated second, Rennenkampf, hated each other because they had a spat some 20 years before at Shenyang at the Battle of Mukden. And so the Germans knew that their commanders knew that one would not support the other, and they confirmed it through radio. So they could destroy the Second Army in detail, and then pursue them at the Battle of Masurian Lakes and destroy them there. So this is what you see is the Germans, and you see the bottom left picture and the bottom right. They are preparing their defenses. The Russians approach very much like this, in mass, and trying to move as quickly as possible. And when you run in mass into a trench system, both prepared and hasty, then you're probably going to lose. one other thing that I'll mention about the operation is that it was known at the time that deception would be important in radio traffic, but the Russians didn't do it. They knew it could be used against them, but their officer culture, going back to what I said before about planning in detail, they did not expect that deception would be necessary. And the strangest thing is that the Germans had to make a gut call. Von Ludendorff had to make a call in his gut based on, it was too good to be true. Could I really believe that these people were handing me all this information? But they determined, partly because of their defense attaché, whose name was Max Hoffman, the one who observed the two generals fight at Mukden 20 years before, he said that based on what he had seen before, the psychology of their professional force is that it likely had not occurred to them to do deception for this battle. So they made the call that they would exploit it, and it paid off. So the result of that battle is that the Germans suffered probably at most around 30,000 casualties, and we know that the Russians suffered around 370,000 casualties. So pretty decisive loss on the behalf of the Russians. So, and that ended. So that was toward the end of 1914. In winter of 1914 going to 1915, the Eastern Front had settled into a more static state of affairs, similar to the West. And the Germans decided that this would not be acceptable. They were going to break through these lines. And in 1915, they launched the Gorlice-Tarnów Offensive. And August von Mackensen was the commander that led that operation. And it was, first it was notable because it began with the largest artillery bombardment in history up to that point. The scale of the artillery bombardment was a success that they had not seen in World War I at that point. It had eviscerated the Russians' defenses to the extent that the Russians were causing their own casualties as they tried to flee the battle, because they were tripping over their own fortifications and they were surrendering en masse after this first artillery bombardment. They were able to reinforce themselves, and the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive continued for that entire spring and summer season. But at the end of this offensive, let's see, I got my notes backwards. At the end of this offensive, the Germans had inflicted almost 1 million Russian casualties and captured 850,000 Russian prisoners of war. And what we saw in this is a bit of an evolution in the Germans' approach to intelligence. What we saw in the battles of Tannenberg was that German intelligence focused on identifying massed formations of the Russians so that they could destroy these formations. In Gorlice-Tarnów, they were pinpointing key capabilities that the Russians had, so command posts, artillery positions, communications nodes. They were identifying those and then targeting those. Even in these mass bombardments, the bombardments focused on where they could remove key capabilities. And this was, as I said, an evolution from targeting to cause mass attrition. There was a protracted, what you could call intelligence preparation of the battlefield for this. Now, the Germans used those balloons that I showed you earlier to identify these positions, report them, and then build methodically enemy situation maps as to where they would aim their artillery. So, some pictures of the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive. This is not the cannon. These are not artillery from Gorlice-Tarnów, but it was artillery of this kind. Those are the ones that you see there were firing on Przemysl, but they would have been moved forward. Those are I would say at least division level artillery pieces, not necessarily the smaller ones. But you can see very large ordnance was coming toward the Russians. You can see on the bottom left is the Russians surrendering and carrying their machine guns on little leashes. And then finally you see perhaps the best dressed officer in history, that's August von Mackensen. And so this map didn't turn out so well. The last one I'll cover is the Brusilov Offensive, which began in 1916. And this represented the point at which the Russians had learned from their intelligence failures, and reformed their organization and their approach to collecting intelligence. So this was the first time in the First World War that we saw the Russians conduct deliberate intelligence planning to support a planned offensive. The Russians used prisoners of war to gather information as to where the Austro-Hungarian forces were located, and the German forces. They corroborated this with overhead imagery that they collected from their aircraft and from balloons, and they used comment deception and SIGINT for the first time in their experience in the war. So I'll run briefly with you how this offensive worked. Is that the Russians, or specifically Alexei Brusilov, commanded the 9th Russian Army, the 9th Russian Army Group in the on the southwest corner, or on the southeast corner of the Eastern Front, and this generally stretched from Romania up until roughly to southern Poland. And what he was going to do is he was going to open up a wide range of attacks along this entire front, not massed on a single point in advance, which was the typical World War I approach. He was going to develop a situation along a broad front, identify weakness, and then mass his forces where he saw the opportunity. And when he did this, he was going to pass forces through, and then when he opens the Austro-Hungarian front, he was going to envelop them from the side and then collapse the Austro-Hungarian lines. To the north of him were two more Russian generals. One of them was Kuropatkin, the other one was Evert, and they were also supposed to coordinate their attacks following his, so that they would the Central Powers would see a failure in the southeast. They would react to it. They would leave openings for Kuropatkin and Evert to exploit. Those two generals did not do that. But what worked in favor of Alexei Brusilov was, first, he had learned from his prisoners of war that the Austro-Hungarians were fixated on Italy at the time. They were not going to, at the time of the offensive, they were not going to be adequately prepared for a massive Russian offensive. He was able to discern that the Austro-Hungarian military culture was rather complacent, was more interested at attending social events. So they were not in a position to react and provide command and control when things were going to go south during that operation. And they probably knew that the Austro-Hungarians were collecting intelligence because the Russians conducted full-scale rehearsals. They built replicas of the trenches that they were going to cross. They did very similar things to what our special forces did in 2011 before they went to kill Osama bin Laden. They had full-scale replicas of where they were going to attack. These were visible from overhead. If you put up collection assets, you would have seen it. The Austro-Hungarians, they found out later, had the information, but it was either not acted upon or it was not analyzed correctly. And so the result of this was when the Russians opened up their wide front, they prepped this with comment deception. They told the Russians that they were going to attack at locations where they didn't, and where they did attack, they focused on seizing the terrain of Kovel, which was a large railroad intersection. That was where their decisive point was going to be, and that's where they massed forces. They gained about 50 miles of terrain in this, which was staggering in World War I up to that point. However, the thing that saved the Central Powers from the success of the offensive was, first, Alexei Brusilov once again for his career it was uncharacteristic, but the Russians once again had misused their cavalry. And once they had achieved this penetration of the Austro-Hungarian lines, they didn't send cavalry forward to exploit it. Finally, they became fixated on capturing Kovel, and the Central Powers continued to reinforce Kovel. The flagging Austro-Hungarian lines received reinforcements from the Germans, who were much better fighters, and Kovel became a nut that was not going to crack. However, the Russians continued to fixate on it. So at the end of the Brusilov offensive, we saw that the Russians had inflicted over 1.5 million German and Austro-Hungarian casualties, had 500,000 prisoners of war, and gained 50 miles of territory at its widest point. You see that's Alexei Brusilov. Down below you see, in the bottom left, you see one of the trenches that the Russians were using. If you compare it to what you saw on the Western Front, these are not deliberate trenches. They were hastily dug, reinforced with wicker, not wood or metal, as we saw in the West. And then on the right side, you see both Russian forces preparing to go over the top and receiving briefings. So some lessons we can observe that are still relevant 100 years after World War I. And there's still things that we tackle. And one thing I'm going to say is lessons observed. That's a very British way of saying it, because the position is that we don't really learn lessons as groups of people. So the first is the importance of decentralization. And whenever we get these new capabilities, there is a desire to give it to the highest or most powerful element in that formation. And it's especially relevant when you have a very sensitive capability, because it can't be widely known. However, decentralizing it, as much as the risk of its compromise grows, it has to be balanced with what is the benefit that comes from sending that to lower levels. Kind of a corollary to the decentralization argument is what we saw in terms of innovation, is that the most important innovations that we saw in World War I were those which started in the field at the tactical level and rose like a tide, rather than those which were imposed from the top, from the highest levels. And much of that innovation that was imposed upon them was proven to be irrelevant as as doctrine caught up to technology, and doctrine was rendered obsolete. Another thing we can learn is that defense attaches can be curiously useful in ways that you never expected. And most militaries, a defense attaché is a more senior person, and they don't usually return back to the tactical army. But the story of Max Hoffman, who observed the Russians fighting amongst themselves 20 years ago, provided valuable advice to his commander, is that if you can send someone to a theater of conflict to know the people that we're going to fight, and then bring that back to the tactical level, it's immensely powerful. The problem was that we don't really know which theaters we're fighting in today are going to become next major military operations. And there's political sensitivities, because defense attachés that are observing conflicts, let's say in Ukraine or in Syria, if they get killed in the fighting, it's questionable whether or not the political will exists to do that and to follow up with that if it does happen. What we saw with the Germans was that they used their capabilities flexibly, especially cavalry. Cavalry was still seen at the turn of the 20th century. It was still seen as the decisive force among most of Europe. They were going to use that to charge and close with and destroy the enemy. The Germans did not use their cavalry for that purpose, and they learned early on that it was best employed as a scouting formation. And in Tannenberg, it provided essential information that allowed them, combined with their SIGINT, to see where the Russians were approaching so that they could mask their effects. The Russians did not do this. They stuck to that doctrine even as late as 1916. And that leads me to my final point, is that older capabilities, even if they are obsolete, can still be useful. So cavalry remained useful, although not as useful as it was before, but was critical. And we learned this lesson I won't say we learned this, but we experienced this lesson in 2001 and 2003 as we tried to reconstitute our human formations in the Army after having, about 10 to 15 years where SIGINT and ELINT was the primary driver of operations. So that is all that I have.